So when I graduated from college, which was nearly 50 years ago, you can do the math, young women in the United States were by and large expected to get married sooner rather than later. I knew almost no one in my college graduating class, which is admittedly small, a few over 100 people, who wasn't either married or engaged. Maybe 4 or 5 people, that few. And young women were expected to make raising a family their career. So just thinking you were going to have a career was unusual. Those who wanted to combine a career with raising a family were seen as anomalies. And this choice was seen as one that necessarily gave short shrift to family life. And family life should come first. So it was a very clear set of messages. This was the early 60s. We were coming out of the 1950s. Those of you who have taken courses that gave you a sense of the sort of historical flow of this will have a sense that the 1950s were a particular time when women were seen in this way and in this way only. Today, combining family and career is the norm, and I'll talk a little bit about that. It sounds like a resolution of a conflict, right? So now most people have both, rather than most people having only family, or even only a career, but only one or the other. But it turns out that there are a lot of complexities and difficulties that go along with this so-called resolution. So women continue, I suspect I don't have to tell you that. Looking at this room, of course, it feels differently, but I suspect your daily lives tell you that women continue to be seriously underrepresented in science and engineering, beginning as undergraduates and continuing through to their presence on the faculties of research universities. So whatever you saw around you as undergraduates, and I assume all of you were undergraduates in science and engineering, you are now seeing even more so as graduate students and even more so among the faculty. I'm going to talk about some of the reasons for this underrepresentation, about some of the approaches universities can take to mitigate those reasons. And I also want to talk about what has changed and what hasn't changed in the 50 years since I received my undergraduate degree. Now, I don't like to talk for long periods of time. My family would dispute that, but it's true. So I'm going to leave a lot of time at the end for people to ask questions or make comments or talk to one another if you want. I don't mean biz, I mean debate one another out loud so we can all hear. Okay, first let's look at some numbers. So this table shows the percentage of undergraduate degrees awarded to women in 7 STEM fields over the last 30 years. And this is most of the science, technology, engineering, and math. So that's a sort of common way, if you haven't heard it, of referring to these fields as STEM fields that aren't in the life sciences. The life sciences picture is different from this picture. So computer science, math, chemistry, physics, mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, and electrical engineering. I chose 30 years as I don't know if any of you can guess why I chose 30 years. I chose 30 years as the time frame because prior to 30 years ago, computer science wasn't broken out separately as a discipline in the data. So I couldn't disaggregate it in the way that I wanted to. The data in these tables are in approximately 10-year intervals. They're not in exactly 10-year intervals because there are no, this is from the NSF database, and that's available, right? You can go on the nsf.gov website anytime you want and sort of muck around in the data that they have there. And they don't have anything after 2008. And so I sort of made it approximately every 10 years. So I think the most striking thing about the table, and we've heard a fair amount about this in recent years, is the fact that computer science and math look a lot different from the other disciplines, right? I'm going to talk about the other disciplines, which look different from other disciplines in the university, but they even look different from the other disciplines. And computer science has created a lot of puzzlement. You all may know more about that than I do. And I'm going to be interested to hear from you about why you think that is going on. But these data show, as the literature reports, that interest in computer science among undergraduate women has actually declined in the last 30 years. Now, actually, what these data show pretty clearly is it's in the last 10 to 15 years that it's declined. So it was kind of steady, not increasing, but not declining, and then seems to have declined. It's the only one of these disciplines. Indeed, it's the only one of disciplines generally, including the life sciences, where that has happened. And I'm not close enough to computer science as a discipline and as a field to have a sense of why that happened. So I'm hoping some of you will have some things to say about that at the end. This is ultimately a question for all of you. I'm not suggesting that you turn all of your energies to it, but it's a question, it really is an issue for computer science as a discipline, and of course disciplines don't do things, people do things. So if it's going to be changed, it's going to be because people figure out what's going on and do something to change it. Now, I'm not going to say too much about math. Math is always looks odd to people. They say, well, wait a minute, 44% of BAs are in math. We think that that's because it's not, again, disaggregated. We think that's because the math numbers always combine those who are interested in theoretical mathematics or applied mathematics, but interested in mathematics for it, not just for itself, and those who are interested in it as something they're going to teach in K through 12 education. So if you are, especially if you want to be a middle school or high school teacher, and you therefore do all your education courses, and these are important things for people to be, you must major in a discipline. And for those who are interested in mathematics and mathematics teaching, they are also in these numbers. And I think they're in other numbers as well, like chemistry, but there are many, many fewer people who go into chemistry teaching than math teaching. I don't know if that's the right explanation for it, but it always, as you'll see, there's a huge drop when we go to look at the PhD students in mathematics, and that's the usual explanation for it, although there are drops in other places too. All right, let's look at the other ones quickly. The thing that is most striking about them, they start in different places. So chemistry starts at 27% of students in 79, and mechanical engineering starts at 6%. But again, here what seems to me to be striking is that they've all approximately doubled. Right, so wherever they started, so the trajectory is the same, right? So wherever they started, they've approximately doubled. Now that's taking chemistry to being 50%. So half the graduates now in chemistry, half of the people who get undergraduate degrees in chemistry now are women, as they have been in biology actually for over a decade. In mechanical engineering, it's now 12%. And so that still feels like a very small number, but the slope is the same. There's certainly differences among them. So one thing it tells you, as I've just said, is that the number of undergraduate women in the department is going to be very different from discipline to discipline. And numbers do matter. So I want to talk about numbers for a minute, right? So the difference between 50% and 12% does, in fact, matter a lot. So 50 years ago, when I graduated from college, and I don't know what all of you think today, and even 35 years ago, when I came to Princeton, I wouldn't have said that. I thought the number of women who were part of a group department, a program, a university, a discipline, was irrelevant to the person's experience. I was wrong. I don't think I was entirely wrong. I just had only half the picture. I was assuming that how well you did was what was going to determine your experience. And it does matter. If you don't do well, you're not as likely to have a good experience. So I'm not suggesting that it's something completely different. But it's not always easy or comfortable to be the only woman or one of a very few women in an academic setting. So why didn't I know this 50 years ago or even 30 years ago? Why do I only see it now? I actually think the reason is pretty simple, looking back over this period of time. Like many of you, I suspect, I don't know for sure, I was, for the first 20 years of my professional career, more often than not, the only woman or one of a small number of women in a given professional setting. That was true in classes. It was true in seminars, not as an undergraduate, because I went to an all-women's college. That does help. It's true in colloquia, in meetings, in my department. You name it, it was the case. It wasn't until it wasn't true, which happened a lot more quickly in psychology, obviously, and much less quickly in my life as an administrator. As you heard, I've been an administrator a good part of my life, and it happened less quickly on that side of the fence, that I could then look back and see the difference. One day, about 10 years ago, I walked into a meeting and felt a little funny. And I looked around, and I realized I was the only woman in the room. And I then realized how long it had been since that was the case. So when I sort of wasn't looking, this had changed. But my point is that it felt different. I could notice the difference between how I usually felt and how I felt walking in that room. I noticed that I was the only woman in the room. I assure you, if I had noticed that every time when I was a young academic, I would have been spending all my time noticing that. I couldn't afford to do it. I had to be wearing a kind of blinkers. Clearly something had changed. The number of women had simply increased to the point where I was rarely the only woman, or even one of a few women. And the critical question, of course, is whether this makes a difference. So I think it does. I think generally, not in every instance, but generally, a person's comfort level increases when that person no longer feels different from everyone else in the room. I think I became more relaxed as this happened. I became more open, more willing to believe I could be stubborn without bad consequences, that I wasn't sitting there trying to figure out, well, if I just stick to this point, what are people going to think? I began to feel that I belonged, most important. And because I wasn't always trying to prove that I belonged, I got to be a better listener. I was paying better attention to everybody else, and I was a better participant. So my performance improved, I think, that's my sense of it, as I became more comfortable. I liked coming to work. Now, I'd always liked coming to work. I wouldn't have lived this life if I didn't like coming to work. If I urge you to do anything, it's to organize your life so you like going to work every day. It's really important. But I really have liked it even more in recent years. And it isn't because what I've been doing has changed, although I have changed what I was doing fairly regularly, and I do like variety, as you could tell. I think it was because the world around me had changed. The structure of the world around me had changed enough so that it made a difference. So one reason I suspect that women don't stay in computer science, that young girls don't stay in computer science, is because there are not very many women. and it's not as comfortable for them, or girls, and it's not as comfortable for them there as it is someplace else. I heard a story about 3 young women majoring in math who decided to go and major in economics. Why? Not because it was easier, not because they were even more interested in it, because their social interactions were more comfortable for them, and they were very explicit about that. Numbers do matter. When you're thinking about numbers, it's very useful to think about the concept of critical mass. So a long time ago now, more than 30 years ago, a sociologist named Rosabeth Moss Kanter at Harvard Business School did some studies on corporations. So these studies are all on for-profit organizations. And at the end of those studies, what she proposed was that when a group includes between 0 and 17% women, women are tokens. They feel like tokens, they are treated like tokens. Groups that include 18 to 35% women, women are a minority. They feel like a minority, they're treated like minority. Groups with more than 35% women are what she called balanced. Now, obviously, the numbers aren't balanced. 35, 65 is hardly balanced. But she's talking about the ways in which people talk about their lives in those kinds of situations. And she talked about 35% as critical mass. There's quite a lot of research in the data about corporations that say that groups that have more than 35% women, gender's not a variable in hiring or performance evaluation, but that it is when the groups are smaller. And this has now been adapted a little bit to higher education and to the academic world because the advanced program, do you all know what the advanced program is? So this is a program that the National Science Foundation sponsors, giving very large grants to a fairly small number of universities, although it's been around for a while, so over the years quite a number have gotten them, to shift the hiring and promotion and daily life culture for women faculty in science, in the STEM fields. And the 9 universities who got the first grants, and these are $5 million grants that were sometimes renewed, so I mean we're talking about good-sized grants, were in fact evaluated in part on the critical mass question, on whether or not in fact departments at the end of the grant had moved toward critical mass. When I was beginning to think about this talk, I asked a computer science friend of mine what he thought the important points would be. He immediately said, without hesitation, talk about critical mass. In his view, when there's critical mass, the situation is stable. And when critical mass doesn't exist, there's a tendency for women to drift away, to change disciplines if they're undergraduates, to change universities if they're faculty members. Now, since he was talking about computer science, I don't think he was talking about 35% women. That just isn't there very often. But I think he was talking about having at least a reasonable number of women around as opposed to a very small number. And this was based, as I said, not on his knowing there was this concept in the literature or any research that had been done on it, but simply thinking about his own experience as a computer scientist. All right. So this is what happens when women go to graduate school and get PhDs in the same 7 fields, same 10-year intervals. Now, obviously, these are women, since they got their degrees in the same years, who graduated, whose BAs and BSs were 5 years or so before each of these. So the first thing I think to look at is the extraordinary increases in PhDs to women in these fields on a percentage basis. When you start very low, you can have a 300% increase, and it's still pretty low. So you've got some of that going on. But every one of these fields has increased steadily and steeply. And the absolute percentage now is still lower, unfortunately, than actually chemistry since 2008. Chemistry's been going up steadily, and I think it's probably over 35% now. And chemical engineering is getting up there really fast as well. Chemical engineering tends to lag chemistry because it's engineering, but it tends to follow chemistry at the same time. And of course, at least in 2008, physics, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering still look complicated. I use that word. If you go back and forth between these two tables, and I don't want to force you to do that, one of the things you see is that the percentage of women getting PhDs is pretty consistently lower than the percentage getting undergraduate degrees, except in electrical engineering and mechanical engineering, in computer science. Well, I shouldn't say. All right. So in math, chemistry, and chemical engineering, the percentage is lower. In computer science, physics, and electrical engineering, it's not very much lower. You can do that quickly. So in about half. This matters. One of the questions that we find consistently is that in many, many fields, the percentage of women that decide to go to PhD programs in computer science or in other fields is lower than the percentage getting undergraduate degrees. So men are more likely, the probability that a given man will decide to keep going is higher than a given woman. And that obviously decreases both the percentages and the numbers at each layer as you keep going. So this is an example in those fields where this happens of what's called a leak in the pipeline. Right? So when you hear people, and this may be something all of you know, but in case some of you don't, so if you think of any given field, there's a pipeline for faculty in computer science, right? So that's something I'm going to worry about here in Princeton, given my job, there's a pipeline for women in computer science becoming academics in computer science. And in some sense, the pipeline extends from the time young children first hear about computers and begin to play around with computers, and extends in a steady way, probably through mathematics, but to some extent increasingly through computer science courses in high school, into college, through college, into graduate school, through graduate school to the decision to apply for and become a faculty member. Okay? So if you think of it that way, then you can think, well, at various points, people drop out. And when you talk about a leak in the pipeline, what you usually mean for women is that the percentage of women that go on to the next stage in the pipeline declines relative to the percentage of men. Right? So if 50% of the undergraduate men who get degrees in computer science, I'm making this up now, and 30% of the women, then the relative percentages in the population are going to decline, right? In the total population, right? I mean, you're starting anyway with more men than women in computer science, and now you're increasing that disparity. So that's what's meant by a leak in the pipeline. For many fields, not for all, there's a substantial leak between undergraduate and graduate school. Women are less likely to go into PhD programs at the PhD level. I didn't bring the master's level data. It didn't seem to me relevant to this particular talk. And it is different. So in those fields where there's not a leak, the question is why. And one of the things that's interesting about those fields is they are uniformly the fields with very small percentages of women getting undergraduate degrees. So one hypothesis is, in other words, in biology or in chemistry or in other fields where there are lots of women getting undergraduate degrees, you see this fall off in terms of women going on. In fields where, like physics, where there's not, you don't see it. One of the hypotheses is that one of the reasons this may happen is because there are very powerful filters earlier in the pipeline than between undergraduate and graduate. In other words, by the time a young woman gets to the point where she's majoring in the field and getting an undergraduate degree, she's already had to survive being the only woman in physics AP, or one of 2 or 3 in a class of 35, or being one of 3 women in a big computer club. Maria? I know she's going to argue with me throughout this. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, well, another hypothesis is, and for instance, I of course know the computer science data extremely well.
Right, better than I do.
All of the fields where women have been highly underrepresented in undergraduate programs, there has been tremendous activity by women in those fields to encourage women to go on to graduate school. And there have been all kinds of programs that give young women access to research as undergraduates, programs while they're actually in graduate school, like women in theory, and they don't exist to the same extent in areas like chemistry and biology because the problem isn't perceived the same way.
No, absolutely, and that's why I said one of the hypotheses is that if your interest is powerful enough to carry you through your experiences in middle school and high school, then your experiences don't change in college, and so you can stay with it in college. So this is a table that gives somewhat parallel data for faculty. I have to tell you, the faculty data are a mess. I mean, there's no other way to put it. This is the best data I could get from the NSF database. I looked at a number of National Research Council reports and other kinds of things. I'm sure there are disciplines that have good data. Maria probably knows good data for computer science, but generally speaking, this was the best I could find. I did not try to track it down discipline by discipline. I don't know that I could have. So what NSF does, which is very frustrating if you're me, is they break it down into computer science, separate from math, at least since the middle 1980s, so at least since 25 years, separate from physical science, but physical science combines physics and chemistry, and you know what that's like. Separate from engineering, which is all of engineering combined. So they're not the most useful data.
So where does chemistry fall with all the women that they have that are under the 17?
That's right. Well, remember, this is faculty, right? So in my generation, the number of women faculty in chemistry is most places 0, right? So this combines assistant professors, associate professors, and full professors. And that's what the faculty data are always going to look much lower, right? If you want to know the relevant pipeline question, all right? So what percentage of women getting PhDs in a field go on to be assistant professors, right, which is the pipeline question. Then what you need to look at is either just assistant professors, and I couldn't find data on just assistant professors, or something that a National Research Council committee looked at and wrote in a report about faculty transitions in the STEM fields, which is the applicant pools for assistant professor positions. And what you find when you look at the applicant pools in that report is that every field, without exception, the Percentage of women in the pool was lower than the percentage of women getting PhDs. And in the life sciences, where people are, everybody does postdocs, right? So in the life sciences, everybody does a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years of postdoc. The percentage of women doing postdocs actually looks like the PhD percentage, but the percentage of women who apply for assistant professor positions in research universities is lower than the percentage of women in either postdocs or getting PhDs. So it looks that what that report argued was that there is a considerable leak in the pipeline between the PhD and applying for assistant professors in. Now that doesn't mean people are giving up their careers. Don't misunderstand me, right? They're going to industry. There are things people can do, especially in the STEM fields. It's a little harder in English. But there are things that the people in the STEM fields can do, professional things, very fulfilling things that are not becoming assistant professors. And there are also lots and lots of places and kinds of places where you can be assistant professors in the STEM fields and in all academic disciplines. But research universities need women who are assistant professors. And they need them for a whole lot of reasons. One is because all academic institutions should have them. Another is that they tend to be the bigger universities, which means more undergraduates are affected by those faculty. And a third reason is that's where the PhD training occurs. You all are at research universities. And if the faculty in the research universities have very few women, it's going to be that much harder for women to imagine themselves being PhD students and then assistant professors in research universities. So the question of why fewer women apply to be assistant professors in research universities is a serious one on the table for people to think about. Now, there are many phenomena in my field of psychology that have multiple causes. My own particular research interest in the last 20 years or so, I have actually moved around, as you may have been able to tell, in my research interests almost as much as I've moved around in my professional life in terms of what I was doing. I've been here almost the whole time, but I just keep doing different things, studying different things. And my own particular interest at the moment is the psychosocial variables that affect and contribute to depression. And when you do research on a problem of that kind, there's very little point in looking for the cause of the phenomenon. And there's a tendency to look for what is the cause of depression. Depression has many different causes in the population and even multiple causes in individuals. The underrepresentation of women in the STEM fields reminds me of depression. Not because we're depressed. No, not at all depressed. Right? Maria isn't at all depressed. We've been doing this for a long time. But I think there are lots of contributing factors. And for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on the one that I know the most about, how hard it is for women to manage both a demanding career and a demanding family life. So let me say again, I don't think this is the only factor contributing to underrepresentation, and I would be delighted at the end of this to have a conversation about other things that you think about. But I think it's an important one, and I think particularly in those fields where women are woefully underrepresented, the daily experiences of women leave much to be desired. I think the family work issue is a major one, and it's the one I want to talk about. And I think it's a major one not just in the STEM fields, but also in the humanities and the social sciences, in fields ranging from English, where women are very highly represented. 75%, 80% of the PhDs now are granted to women, to fields where they're not so well represented, even outside of STEM. Economics is the obvious example there. I was really delighted to see that the organizers of the conference, and I'm looking at Tal, apparently think this is an important topic as well, because there's a panel tomorrow on work-life balance. And I don't know, of course, I don't even know who the panelists are, much less what they're going to say. But I'm now going to give you my take on what I think this important problem looks like. And then I want to talk a little bit about how concern about this issue has evolved, at least at Princeton, and I'm hoping at universities generally. I spend a lot of my time around the country talking about this, and about what universities can do to make it possible for women and men, because men's lives have changed too, to have and meet the demands of career and family. First, let me say that I do not believe there's such a thing as work-life balance. How's that for a shocking statement? I think at least for me, feel that if I want to have a lot of pieces to my life, and I do, I'm going to have to live with the fact that I'm going to always feel at least slightly out of balance. It just doesn't matter where I am. There's always someplace I'm not that I would like to be. And there isn't anything that I can do about that. It's simply a reality of my life. So I'm always having to choose, and there are choices, what I'm going to do, where I'm going to be, what I'm going to be focused on. But I can rotate it, and I do. So I think my first piece of advice would be, for those of you who are inclined to chase after elusive balance, don't do it. You'll be really frustrated. Maria's laughing. I actually have sometimes titled talks that I give the work-life juggle. I've come to think of it as a lot more like a juggle than like a scale or a balance or something you can achieve that way. At the same time, I think you ought to be able to look at your employers. And this is not just true of universities, although I'm going to focus on universities. I think you ought to be able to look to your employers to help you have both a fulfilling life, a fulfilling professional life, and a fulfilling family life. So I was telling somebody at a group at breakfast, I had already, because I was traveling this week, I actually outlined this talk and put the slides together a couple of weeks ago. And then this week, a sort of large conversation blew up in the newspapers. It was on the front page of the New York Times because my colleague Anne-Marie Slaughter has a cover article in this month's Atlantic Monthly that was released on Wednesday. And most of the things that I've read about it, I've read the article, but contrast it with an article that Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook wrote a month or so ago, in which they said rather different things. So Anne-Marie, when Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State, she was appointed the Director of Policy for the Department of State. This is a major position, to say the least. She moved to Washington, and her husband, who is a professor here of politics as well, and her two boys stayed here, and she commuted on the weekends. I'm not telling you anything that isn't in the article about her personal life. And she writes about how extraordinary this was, both stimulating and difficult, and about how, as at least one of her children began to hit rough water, and let me tell you, you may be lucky enough to have children who never hit rough water, but it sure wasn't true for me, and it hasn't been true for any of my close friends. So that does happen. And Anne-Marie finally decided that she just simply couldn't continue to do this extraordinary stimulating job. She would come back and do the extraordinary stimulating job of being a professor of politics, but at least she would be in the same place as her family with a more flexible schedule than she had. This article writes about that and writes about how the structure of the environment in high-level government doesn't allow any of the kinds of flexibility that she needed at that time, and then goes on to talk about the structure of professional environments generally, that it's not just about high-powered Washington, it's about professional environments. So this brings me, and I think this is true of universities. So this brings me to why universities, I think, should care a lot about work-life balance of their faculty and to what they think they can do to help. So why should universities care about work-life balance? Well, things have changed. That's what I was partly talking about early in my talk. When I was an undergraduate and a graduate student and a young faculty member, today's, people assumed that women were going to have families and not have professional careers, or they might work for a couple of years. I actually knew women, ready to be shocked? I actually knew women who were my contemporaries at highly selective colleges, who when they got out of college said, well, I'm going to go be a secretary in a law firm or a whatever, because that way I'll meet men that I could marry. Said it openly. Today, that's of course not the case. And everybody under the age of 50, and a lot of people over the age of 50, but everybody under 50 grew up in a world in which everyone assumed that both men and women would work. So the old norm of male faculty beavering away in their offices and labs while their children were at home raising the children and doing volunteer work has given way to a new norm in which both men and women work and work hard. So when I came to Princeton, there was a wonderful group called the University League. It was composed of university faculty wives. And after I'd been here a few weeks, I got a phone call from the president of the University League. And she said, we have a dilemma. You're not a faculty wife, but we'd like you to be a member, because you are a woman, right? So I said, well, of course I'll be a member, and I have been. But that problem, that just gives you a sense of how sort of uniform that was. So this is actually a broad population shift. When I talk to department chairs, as I do a lot, about dual career families and the fact that we at Princeton, and this should be true at every university, think about recruiting faculty as recruiting families, not as recruiting individual faculty members, because all the people in the family have needs, and both members of a couple, if there is a couple, are likely to have career needs. So when I'm the person at Princeton who's in charge of the career needs of the spouse or partner of the person we're recruiting, right? So I do the dual career piece. And when I call, especially a new chair who hasn't been chair before, with whom I haven't worked before, I often start by saying, what percentage of US households in the 2000 census, because it's probably lower now, do you think consist of one working parent, one non-working parent, and children under the age of 18? Right? The norm when I was young. And, you know, I get guesses. You can imagine the guesses I get. And then I tell them, in 2000, only 7% of US households had what we still think of as the normal family configuration. If you take out the young people who don't have children yet and the older people whose children are grown and out of the house, and you only look at those households that include children under the age of 18, only 23% have one working parent and one non-working parent. 10 years ago, I bet it's lower now. So fewer than a quarter of households look like the canonical family in the United States. And yet this notion that that's the norm persists. So here are some data from Princeton. This is from a 2007 survey. We have a 2012 survey. We do it every 5 years out in the field now, but I don't expect it to change. It didn't change much between 2002 and 2007. Among those who were married or had in domestic partnerships, and Princeton, that's a very high percentage. I mean, this is a wonderful family town, as anyone will tell you, and so our faculty tend to come married or partnered. 98% of women among the tenured faculty and 75% of men report working spouses or partners. And among the tenured track faculty, 96% of women and 81% of men report. So about the same. Actually, if you split the tenured faculty into those who are over 50 and under 50, the non-working spouses are significantly among the older faculty, right? Those who are in my generation. So younger tenured faculty tend to have 85% working spouses.
Is there a split between the jobs of the partner spouses? Because of course there's a difference if your partner is a lawyer working also a full-day schedule, and if your partner is a teacher who comes home at 3.
Yep, fair enough. I don't have systematic data on it. I can tell you that it is very hard for people, just judging from knowing them, as well as my own life, which has this characteristic, it's hard to have two people in a relationship, both of whom have very high-powered careers. Whichever way it goes, whether one of them has whichever one has a less slightly high-powered career. And we have a lot of same-sex partnerships here as well. So my observation is that generally speaking in couples, either the man or the woman will be less focused on careers. And for us, most often, not always, it'll be whoever isn't the faculty member. But it's not always true.
It's interesting what you're saying, because I would assume that the women most likely have husbands who have high-powered careers and are really struggling, probably bearing most of the house load, while for the men, their women have less powerful careers and are really being assisted by the woman, even if she has a job. They're being able to focus more on their work, which is something that I think eventually also plays into these disparities in numbers between men and women.
I suspect you're right across the population. I think because what I'm starting with is the recruiting of a faculty member who's either a man or a woman. I may see a particular, right? In other words, I'm starting with someone who already has, by definition, a high-powered career, and I really haven't looked at my data that way. Maria, do you have data?
I don't have data, but if I think about, I know, at least when I left here as Dean of Engineering 6 years ago, I knew the situation for every single woman.
You did indeed.
faculty member.
You were my source.
Yeah, and I would say that the majority of female faculty members here had a spouse whose career was either equivalent or less. Okay, so, you know, when I think about the people that the female faculty were married to, there was nobody who had a more important career than they did. There were people who had, you know, spouses who were also faculty members at a high rank, you know, at an elite or research university. There were people who had stay-at-home dads, essentially, or, you know, people who just had much less demanding careers. But so, and females were about 50% of the faculty in engineering school.
That's very surprising.
Well, it's actually, I mean, if I then take the University of British Columbia, so a large research university, same situation for female faculty members in the Faculty of Science. Okay, so at least, and if I think about probably my college, elite, small, liberal arts college, and think about spouses of our women faculty, almost none of our women faculty have somebody, I can think of one example of somebody who has somebody who's married to somebody who is has a faculty position at UCSD, and she actually just moved from Harvard College to UCSD because they just had their second kid. But so, at least in my experience, the people that I know who are female faculty in areas of science and engineering are not, you know, the lesser person in the career.
But may I ask for a little more clarification? Because my experience from looking around my colleagues at MIT is that the women are married to men who may have maybe a slightly less high power, or they might be at a university that's a bit less fancy, but they still work a full
Oh, absolutely.
more than 40-hour week.
Yeah, no,
Whereas the
No,
men
what-
are married to women that either work part-time, or they can definitely be home at 4 and they can pick up the kids.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they
No,
don't
that's
have
not
to-
my-
I'm talking about the women who become faculty, that they are, very few of them are sacrificing their career. I mean, if you talk to the women who become faculty at institutions like MIT or Princeton or Harvard Med or UBC, they're not sacrificing their career to somebody else. But I agree, most of their spouses also work at, you know, prestigious places and are faculty members and so on. Not all of them, but many of them do. Whereas I totally agree with you, if you look at male faculty, it's quite often.
But that's exactly the point that I was making, that was exactly the point, that the women who are faculty are struggling because they have a very powerful husband as well. And they're probably bearing most of the household and so on, while the husbands who are faculty have women who support their lifestyles.
My experience is that most of the women I know, and I know a lot, have husbands who really partner in terms of responsibilities. Okay, that's been my experience. So, I mean, there are counterexamples, but my husband does that, and most of the husbands of other women I know.
I would assume that statistically, that it's not correct. But, you know, it's just,
Well, I'm talking about women faculty at
Yeah.
elite institutions, because I don't think you can survive.
There's also a sort of a conditional problem there, that I'm talking about women at elite institutions that didn't sacrifice their job for their husband or partner. But of course they didn't, because they're at elite institutions. So you sort of have to look at all those women
Right.
who
That's right.
got their
That's why I said I'm
PhD
looking at a
and
special
got that
population.
faculty.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. So what I'm saying is that the women who are at outstanding institutions, they tend to be the women who manage to find a partner who's going to support them.
I'm reminded of a friend of mine who's a tenured professor at, and actually chair of the Department of Physics at Yale, who once said to a group I was part of, the one piece about personal life that I give my graduate students is be careful who you marry. So I pass that along.
Could I
It-
add to that?
Yeah, sure.
I think this was mentioned in the Anne Marie Sardas article as well. It's very important whom you marry because he or she would support your career. And without that support, it might be impossible to have a career. And
I think
Or
I
maybe
believe
before
that
marriage.
personally.
Yeah.
I would not, as much of a juggle as it was to raise a child and have a dual career house with two high-powered careers, and my husband is an architect with a national practice, I couldn't have done it if he hadn't been utterly supportive and doing whatever he could, just as I was doing whatever I could, and we solved problems together. It just doesn't, I don't believe it works. But, and having mentioned my daughter, who's now 26 and out of the house, one of the things that people sometimes say is that women pursue their careers at the expense of having children. And I do think that sometimes happens, that women make that decision. There are many decisions that can be made. This is a slide that comes from Ginger Zakian, a friend of mine who's a tenured faculty member, senior faculty member in biology and molecular biology. So these are data that she has been providing her students and the students in molecular biology from the fall of 2010. 35 at that time, 35% of the tenure track faculty, so that's assistant, associate, and full professors combined, were women. 12 of the 13 women faculty were married. 10 of the 13, 77% of the female faculty have children, with 19 children total, so lots of people have 2 and occasionally 3. And 83% of the male faculty have children. So it's a little bit more of the male faculty who have children, but not a huge difference. All the women in molecular biology had children before they were tenured. And a little more than half of the 13 women are tenured. So I suspect it's 7 of the 13. She uses these data to say it's doable. Right? I think these are good data to say it is doable. I'm talking a lot about how hard it is. I want to say it is doable. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we might go about rebalancing the norm. We've already said that men and women both have equal claim to careers and in principle equal claim to family life. That's my nod to the additional pressures, no, more than a nod, acknowledgement of the additional pressures on women. And my argument has been, as I say, and I try to proselytize across the country on this subject, that the kinds of resources that faculty need from universities and that universities should provide have changed. And the reason that universities should provide this is because they want their faculty to be as productive as their faculty can be. And faculty are going to be more productive. They're going to do a better job for the university if the university provides family-friendly supports. All right? So it is the right thing to do. That's one thing you can argue. I'm arguing that it is in the self-interest of universities to provide these. And of other organizations as well, not just universities. I just know universities well. One of the things that I have observed that is not, I think, frequently observed is that this is not a new issue for colleges and universities. What's changed is the family configurations, because when men work and women took care of the family, the supports that the universities provided, isn't that they didn't provide supports, it's just that those supports reflected that configuration. So faculty members who were male got working conditions and resources they needed in order to do their research and teaching. But but they also got support for their family lives. And we tend to think there wasn't anything there, but there was, right? There was health and life insurance, pension contributions, mortgage programs, college tuition programs. When your wife is at home taking care of the children, this is what you need, right? You're the breadwinner, you need these things to support the family. Those things haven't changed. You can't stop providing those things. This is not a trade-off. But in addition, new kinds of support are needed. And I've already said people will be more productive. The other argument I make is that if universities provide this, they will be more attractive to faculty. And not just to women faculty, right? Because even in situations where men and women have equally high-powered careers, or even if the woman's career is a little bit less high-powered, everybody's working. Everybody has a certain amount of stress and strain on the household. So men need this as well as women. By and large, especially among younger faculty, spouses don't stay home. And if they do, I mean, you know, there's this sort of, I think of it as a myth, because this is, my experience is a little bit different. So there's this myth about, well, women have their children and then they stop working and that's that, and they go back to the old configuration. But the census data suggests it's not true. And even more than that, the national data are that the average amount of time, this is not about academics, this is about women working, period. The average amount of time that women stay out of the workforce after they've had children, a child, is 18 months. So women are working. Now, this is really Tal's question, right? And others of you. Having said that this affects men, I don't think that it affects men and women equally. I don't think providing family-friendly supports means as much generally to men as it does to women. And the reason I don't think so is because there are lots of data that actually look at the amount of time that women spend on their family lives. And it doesn't matter whether women are working or not. They tend to, there are exceptions, but in general, women spend more time on their family lives than their spouses and partners do. Right? So that was your point, Tal, right? And that means that the need for support is greater among women. It makes bigger difference in their lives if you provide it than it does for men. But I'll tell you, the men here are grateful for it. The other thing that happened here, and that I've been trying to persuade people across the country should think about, is that when you put in family-friendly programs for faculty, for assistant professors, one of the things you inadvertently do is to send a signal to postdocs and graduate students. When you get to be a faculty member, you're going to have these supports. Don't start your family while you're a graduate student or a postdoc. Wait, they're coming, they're coming. So we decided here that we didn't want to send that message. It was the wrong message to send. We wanted to send the message that you should start your family whenever it's right for you. It may be when you're a graduate student, even an early graduate student. It may be when you're a tenured faculty member. The supports would be there at Princeton whenever you wanted to do that. So we looked at graduate students and postdocs and took the faculty programs and policies and extended them where we could, and tried to think of new ones that were particular to the lives of graduate students and postdocs that we could put into place. The other thing we thought about is the fact that what I refer to as one size fits all doesn't fit all. There's a tendency to think that if you do this, whatever this is, one thing, what's going to happen is that everybody's going to be happier. But in fact, that one thing is going to suit some people and not others. So universities, and I expect other organizations as well, corporations, so on, need to think about what's the whole set of things that people might need so that people can decide what they need at any given point in time. And in universities, especially now, I'm sure I don't have to tell you that, the last few years have been very tight financially, and so often people say to me, well, we can't possibly institute a whole bunch of supports and programs. We just can't. We can't afford it. And my answer always is plan for it. Figure out what you want to do. Say that you want to do it. Do what you can. Say that you know it's not everything. But make a complete plan. Because if you plan it piecemeal, you don't have something that works very well. So this is the faculty programs. I'm not going to go through them one by one. You don't need that. What I do want to say is that we've done most of these. We've been lucky. A lot of them we were able to get into place before. Nobody's come in recent years, but when we first put it in, which was 5 years or so ago, more, 7 or 8 years, women would come more often than men, but men too, both men and women. People would come and they would say, I don't want it. I don't need it. And we would say, if you look in the rules and procedures of the faculty, you will find that any assistant professor can ask to be considered for tenure at any time. If you want to come up early, your tenure date is now 7 years later, not 6 years later, whatever that is. If you want to come up early, that's absolutely fine. Talk to your department chair. You will be considered. So, yes, it's mandatory. You can't change it. That's the required time when you come up. But you can ask to come up earlier. Do people ask to come up earlier? Reality has a way of intruding.
So that goes to a point that I'm thinking. I think that in some ways we're trying to level the playing field. And clearly, for anybody who's been pregnant, it's nothing like being with a mother and being with a father. So by giving the men the same advantage that you give the women with the 1-year extension, it's not clear that you're improving the situations for the women, which should be the goal.
Absolutely fair question. So actually, interesting. So there's a group called the MIT 9 that Princeton is part of. It's MIT, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Michigan, Berkeley, Stanford, Caltech, Penn. And they just met here last week. I hosted them here in this building, a friend upstairs in the convocation room. And this is a continuing discussion in that group. And particularly, I had a long exchange with my colleague from MIT. These are all people who sort of do the same kind of diversity work and women in faculty work that I do. Because MIT only provides extensions for women. I think you have to make a choice, and we were very explicit about it. We discussed this, right? I don't deny at all, and I wouldn't deny that across, generally speaking, women, quote, need it more because they spend more time on their families than men do. At the same time, if you give it to both, you both acknowledge that some men do really genuinely either split the work or do more, and you send a signal saying this is the way we think the world should be. It's a kind of particular kind of high road, if you will, symbolic high road. We decided we wanted to be clear that our view was that both men and women should need this, because you have to do one or the other. You have to either be saying women are always going to be the people who spend more time, or you have to say we think it should go this way.
But how can you say that it would go this way? A woman nurses the child 7, 8, 9 months. She's up all night. She's tired
Okay.
all the time.
Okay.
It's
No,
not
but what you, this is, but Okay, so, but I also, wait a minute, Tal, wait a minute. I do want to point to the fact that it comes also with workload relief. Let me just finish this. Workload relief for the primary caretaker. So what the woman most often gets, because she's usually the primary caretaker, though sometimes men are, is a semester with no teaching, or a year with only a half load of teaching. So there is an accommodation for that greater load, and I do think you have to pair them. I do think you have to pair them. I'm sorry, Maria.
Well, I mean, Valerie was arguing with how, we both have husbands who were up. My husband was up more hours than I was with our children.
Yeah.
We had children that didn't sleep until they were 8 months old. And,
Yes.
and it's amazing that you have 2 of them. But, I mean, really, he did spend at least as much time when the children were small. And then, because my career became more intensive as I went on, he actually spent more time taking the kids to doctors and dance lessons and soccer practice than I did. So, and frankly, I have an awful lot of female friends who have exactly that situation. Ann Condon has the same situation with her kids. We have made decisions to choose people to partner with very explicitly, where we have said we're both going to do it. And, so, I mean,
I fear you're spreading false hope. I truly believe it. I mean, we are talking on average, right? So it could be that Nick is this way and that other husbands, and you can find a handful, maybe possibly around the men here in this room. But first of all, I want to say I haven't heard about the man that can nurse, but I will be hearing about it shortly. And kids that are problematic are a different thing, but I want to say normal kids that do sleep and so on, but only nurse, that is really, there's no sense in the father getting up, and they do sleep better than the women during the first months.
Okay, well,
that's your experience. I'm talking about my experience, and I know a ton of women with husbands like this.
1, 2, 3.
So I would like also to raise a point here that, okay, you solve the problem among you and your partner as a woman, but what about the biggest problem that we have in society, that we still discriminate against men? You go for the same job, you have the same experience, and you know as much as a man do, but when it comes to negotiate for salary, we're given paid less than man. And then we are not have tendency a year later to go and say, I want a raise. Which a man every 6 months go to his boss and say, hey, I want a raise. I did that and I need to get a raise. Are we done? So, and then that also adds to the whole equation that, okay, you solve it between you and your partner, but at some point when your partner can make more and there are responsibilities at house, who's going to go to the job? So that's also part of my frustration. And unfortunately, at this point, women say, okay, fine, we're not doing it. And we stay home, and the whole career, the whole 20-something years or 30 years that I studied, doesn't matter, so my family needs me. So that's also something that I'm dealing with a lot, and I just get upset.
I'm going to say one thing, just, I don't know what you want to do about this conversation because you're out of time. And you wanted your talk short.
I did. I didn't think it was going to, this is great.
So the question is, and all these topics are going to be discussed in the panel. I mean, you can bring up all your things in the panel. There's going to be a lot of time to get the broad spectrum of opinions. As you can see, me and Maria on the 2 edges.
Right. Well, and there are obviously other people who want to be heard here.
Yes.
So
the question, so let's take 2 more comments and then you'll continue and finish.
right, I'm going to finish. I mean, we've gotten to the we've gotten to the discussion before.
Yes, but you're going to have to finish before that because we're going to
Okay.
schedule. So
Okay, that's right.
The
No.
women, you raise their hands and then we'll continue with your talk.
Just really quick, coming back to the tenure clock thing. If it's in a situation where you only give it to a woman and you're both faculty, then the man can say, well, you get this clock thing, so you have to do this because I don't get what I believe. And that puts people in a situation where even if they don't want to adhere to those gender roles, they're forced into it because that's what
wanted to add to that. One thing that was mentioned in that Atlantic article was that the tenure extension used to not be automatic, and that a lot of women were coming in and saying that they felt strange about taking the tenure extension because they felt that they would be looked down upon for taking it, that they would be thought of as not as serious about their careers. And so by offering it to both, you sort of eliminate this stereotype that the women won't take their careers as seriously by making everyone take it.
Right.
I just want to comment on this point. I just want to say one thing about that, 2 years ago, Nancy Lynch was here. And this I didn't even know, she's a very prominent professor at MIT. She apparently got her position at MIT on a women's slot, which I didn't even know. Nancy Lynch. I'm not kidding. I'll say it was Fleur. And she said, you should take every advantage that's given to you, and you should use it and utilize it, and eventually nobody will remember. So this is you do a good job. So this point that you're saying that women don't want to take this advantage, I think we should take everything that's thrown at us and utilize it to our advantage. So
But it does, but it can have consequences. I mean, I think the notion that you'll be expected to do more at home by your husband because you got the extension and he didn't is clearly an issue. And I think that one of the things that giving it across the board does is that people who evaluate the work are less likely to say, well, it's a woman who got an extension, and so she should have gotten more done than the man who didn't get an extension, which is, of course, not the point of the extension. So I think there are some counterbalancing things in here. So I've been told I have to wrap up. I'll stay for the break if people want to talk about things, but let me just say, okay, so my basic message is things are better. I mean, this is really, doesn't sound like it, does it? But things really are better than they were when I started. There's a positive trajectory overall. I do want to urge you to hang in there. I want to urge you not to give up. I want to urge you to think about becoming a faculty member. I think universities have lagged behind corporations. When I hear what Google does for supports, I'm kind of just astonished because it's across the board. They provide amazing things. I know how tempting that can be, but universities are beginning to think about these things. This is a great life being a faculty member. It really is a great life. It's fun. There is a certain amount of flexibility in it. There's what creates the lack of flexibility, and this is what Sheryl Sandberg was actually saying. What creates the lack of flexibility in a life is when you have to be there from, if you have to be at the office from 7 in the morning until midnight, like the associates in a law firm, right? That's an inflexible life. But if you're a faculty member, you can, and you want to work between midnight and 3 or 10 and 1, because that's after your kids have gone to bed, you can do that. You've got a lot more room to move things around that way. Not true for lab scientists. I mean, I'm talking to all of you because you're not, that doesn't characterize you. If you're a bench scientist, it really locks you in. That's a different issue. You get to inspire the next generation of women in theory. Take that seriously. It feeds the soul. I'll tell you, there's nothing better than your graduate students. So if you look at Ada Lovelace and Grace Hopper, and those were the only two names I knew, so I went and Googled them and looked at what they accomplished at a time when, oh my God, can you imagine what it was like to be them in their world as a woman? So it was a lot harder then, and they accomplished a lot. At the same time, as you think about being a faculty member, do look for universities that explicitly say these are issues that are important, that say we care about this, and that try to provide the support you need. They won't all be able to. Some of them are not expensive at all. Some of them are quite expensive. So they won't be able to do everything, but at least look for the attitude. It really matters if the university cares about these issues in the right way. and have a great personal life and a great professional life. Thank you.